Good to go?
I think.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of Fireside Chats with Dave. Tonight, we're going to keep our conversation going about the history of golf in Western Pennsylvania. But tonight, instead of talking about the foundations of courses and things of that nature, tonight we're going to talk about the tournaments. And most importantly, we're going to talk about the 9 U.S. Open championships that have been contested in Western Pennsylvania. Tonight is going to be a very heavy Oakmont Country Club episode, as all 9 U.S. Opens that have been hosted and contested in Western Pennsylvania have been contested at none other than the fabled links on Holton Road in Oakmont. So let's dive right into it. Let's start with the very first U.S. Open held at Oakmont, and that was 1927. Everybody expected the phenom that was Bobby Jones to run away with the tournament. He had won 2 years earlier at Oakmont in the U.S. Amateur. Gene Sarazen was also a favorite that week, as he had won the 1922 PGA at Oakmont. And for all the golf fans out there that were rooting for Sarazen and Jones, they'd come out disappointed, as Scottish golfer Tommy Armour ended up winning the Open that week. He defeated a gentleman by the name of Harry Lighthorse Cooper in a playoff to win his first of 3 career major championships and his first and only U.S. Open. Now, when it came to Sarazen and Jones in that Open, Bobby Jones would suffer the worst finish in his career in a U.S. Open at the 1927 contest in Oakmont, and he finished in a tie for 11th. He was still the low amateur, but it was the only time in his career where he would finish outside the top 10 in a U.S. Open. As for Gene Sarazen, had a very good week. He actually finished runner-up to Cooper and to Armour and missed out on the playoff by 1 shot. Going ahead to 1935, that's the next time the Open was here. If Armour was an unexpected champion, then Sam Parks Jr. was, as Bill Murray said in Caddyshack, a true Cinderella story. Sam Parks is a local boy. He was born in Bellevue, grew up in the city of Pittsburgh, attended the University of Pittsburgh, and got his first golf lesson in 1922 by none other than Gene Sarazen. When he graduated from Pitt, he became the head pro at Highlands Country Club, which was in the North Hills. And in 1935, he got the head pro position at South Hills Country Club, where he had qualified for the U.S. Open. And as the story goes, he wanted to have a good finish in the 35 contest, so he called up to Oakmont and longtime head professional Emil Leffler. Now, Leffler knew the course like the back of his hand. He had grown up caddying on the course. He was also the club's green superintendent. And in 1927, he actually became both the superintendent and the head professional. So Parks calls over to Leffler and asks if Emil would show him around the course, give him a couple of tips and tricks. And to Parks' surprise, Leffler invites him to come over every morning at dawn for a month leading up to the U.S. Open to really learn how to chip and putt and play the tough links at Oakmont. And the hard work paid off. Sam Parks would win his first and only PGA Tour event, his first and only major, and he did it right here in his hometown. He defeated Jimmy Thompson and Walter Hagen to take the crown, and a few years later, he would retire from golf altogether and become an executive with United States Steel. Now, as we go forward, there's no U.S. Open in our area or at Oakmont in the 1940s because of the Second World War. The next time the Open returns to Oakmont and to Western Pennsylvania is in 1953, which is arguably one of the greatest golf seasons in history because of none other than Ben Hogan. Now, Ben Hogan is a bit of an idol of mine. I believe that he is one of the 3 best golfers in history. And Hogan's 53 season was nothing short of just amazing. In April, he won at the Masters. It was, I believe, his second time winning at Augusta. And He came into Oakmont with high hopes of claiming his fourth U.S. Open in his career. But the way the USGA had the tournament set up at the time was the defending champion was the only exempt player in the field. And Hogan did not win in 1952. So just like the other 155 contestants, he would have to qualify. So he qualified at Oakmont and the Pittsburgh Field Club. And on the eve of the championship, he was asked by a group of reporters some questions leading up, about his thoughts about the Open. And Hogan was a very introverted personality. And when it came to his dealings with the media, he was often characterized as quite cold and distant. And on this particular evening, Herbert Warren Wynn of the New York Post asked Ben, Oakmont has all these treacherous ditches and bunkers. How do you plan on traversing them this week? And in typical Hogan fashion, he said, well, I don't plan on being in them. So a little flabbergasted by Ben's response, Herb asked Ben, well, Ben, what's your strategy to win the Open? And Hogan takes a drag of his cigarette, looks back at Herb and says, to shoot the lowest score. Are we finished here? So the man of few words was done talking for the evening, and he let his play speak for him over the next 3 days. He goes out Thursday morning, and he shoots the course record and tournament record at Oakmont at that time of 67. And he would go on to win his fourth and final U.S. Open wire to wire, defeating the legendary Sam Snead by 6 shots. Now, Hogan would go on to win the British Open that year, and he'd have the first 3 legs of the Grand Slam before falling short by not getting the PGA Championship to add to that collection. But for Hogan's year, he played in a grand total of 6 tournaments. He won 5 of them, and 3 of them were majors. Absolutely phenomenal golf, and probably, arguably, one of the biggest names to win in our area and at Oakmont. Well, fast forward 9 years to the showdown in the 1962 U.S. Open between Jack Nicklaus and Arnold Palmer. Palmer, the local boy, the Latrobe native, came into that tournament expecting to win. He had won the Masters for a 3rd time in April, and he was the odds-on favorite heading into the Open in 62. He was playing some fantastic golf, though he was struggling a little bit with the putter. And had he putted well that week, he would have won the U.S. Open at Oakmont in 62 handedly, probably by 5 or 6 shots. He struggled so much on the greens that Jack Nicklaus, the then 22-year-old rookie out of Ohio State, defeated Palmer to win his first of a record-setting 18 major championships. Now, the tail of the tape, like I said, came down to putting. Arnold 3-putted 11 times over the course of the Open in 1962. Jack 3-putted just once. And the ending in the playoff is immortalized by a great picture. You probably would have seen it in our advertisements for the Fireside chats of Jack and Arnold shaking hands. And this picture is known as the changing of the guard. Over the next 3 decades, Jack would become the face of golf. And going into the 62 Open, Arnold was the king. He was not just the biggest golfer in the world, but arguably one of the biggest athletes in the world. And 2 fun stories come out of the 62 Open that a lot of people don't know about. First of all, there was the playoff to determine the winner between Jack and Arnold. And the way that a playoff worked in those days was the winner of the 18-hole playoff for the U.S. Open took home the ticket gate for that day. So the cost of the tickets and the general the amount of money that was generated by the playoff alone was about $10,000 in 1962. So whoever would win would take home that extra $10,000 for the pot. And it was very common at the time for the playoff participants to split the gate. That way, each player would take home a little bit of money. Now, Arnold at this time is the king of golf. He is arguably one of the wealthiest athletes on the planet. And he goes up to Jack on the driving range that morning and offers to split the gate with the young 22-year-old, and is flabbergasted to find that Jack tells him no. Jack is playing for the entire pot. He's all in. And honestly, this angers Arnold quite a bit, and it gets under his skin. And it was some great psychological warfare on Jack Nicklaus's part, because Arnold's play certainly struggled in the playoff, especially on the greens. And Jack ended up winning his first major by 4 shots. And a second fun story that comes out of the Open that year is everybody nowadays knows that Jack and Arnold were incredibly good friends. And the reason they became such close friends in their lives and in their careers was because of the Open at Oakmont in 1962. During play that week, the fans treated Jack horribly. They yelled in his backswing. They called him Fat Jack. They would cheer when he made bogey. They'd boo him. Excuse me. Would boo him when he made par. And Arnold, on numerous occasions, told the crowd to knock it off and let Jack play unimpeded. And during the playoff in 62, Winnie Palmer was out following her husband, as was a young Barbara Nicholas. And Winnie saw Barbara and decided to go up and to apologize to her for the way the fans were treating Jack that week. And they struck up a conversation, and they ended up walking the entire 18-hole playoff together. And by the end of it, they were the best of friends. Well, in subsequent weeks, the two would meet up every time Jack and Arnold were playing in the same tournament. They'd go out to dinners together, and eventually they spent so much time together that Jack and Arnold were spending a lot of time together away from the golf course. And that great friendship and rivalry really was born here in Western Pennsylvania during the 1962 U.S. Open at Oakmont. You fast forward to 1973, and everybody remembers that U.S. Open for Johnny Miller's miracle 63 on Sunday to win the U.S. Open. Miller entered the final round of the 63 Open 6 shots back of, you guessed it, Arnold Palmer. But what a lot of people don't know about that week is, of course, Miller shot the course record and the major championship scoring record on Sunday with that 63. But the course record had been broken 3 of the 4 tournament days during the 73 U.S. Open. On Thursday, Gary Player shot 72 on a par 71 course, which was the new scoring record for Oakmont in a U.S. Open. And the very next day, that record was broken by a club professional named Gene Borek out of New York. He shot 65. On Saturday, there was a lot of rain. Miller shot 76 and thought he really was out of the tournament. There was no way that Arnold or Julius Burroughs would blow this lead. And what Johnny was hoping for was a solid finish and a nice paycheck and to move on to the next tour stop the following week. Well, Miller tees off about 2 hours before Arnold, and he starts out with 4 consecutive birdies. He's 4 holes in. He's now 2 shots back, and he's feeling pretty good about himself, and he thinks, wow, I'm in this. I actually have a chance to compete in this U.S. Open. Well, he would make a very uncharacteristic bogey at the long par 3 8th, which would fire him up to make birdie at 9, and he'd go out in 32. And then on the back 9, he would make birdies at 11, 12, 13, and 15. A very tough stretch of holes, and then he'd par his way in. When he finished his round, he had shot 63, and he was 1 shot back of Palmer, who at that point was teeing off the 12th hole with 6 to play. And Johnny met his wife, Linda, just off the green at 18 and said to her, honey, we're standing right here. No offense to Mr. Palmer, but this course is too difficult for him to hold this lead. And over the next hour and a half, Johnny Miller sat there watching group after group come in. And when Arnold finally finished, Johnny Miller was, in fact, the 1973 U.S. Open champion at Oakmont with that record-setting 63. He birdied 9 of the 18 holes that day. He had a birdie putt on all 18 holes, which is just absolutely amazing when it comes to the greens and regulation statistic. And with all the stats that are available nowadays, it is shown that Miller had no longer of a birdie putt than 9.5 feet during that round. So he put himself in great position on every hole to make birdie and to shoot that magical 63. 10 years later, in 1983, the U.S. Open returned to Oakmont. It was won by Larry Nelson, who didn't take up the game of golf until he was 21 years old and took it up in the most unusual of places, and that was in South Vietnam. While he was serving in the U.S. Army during the 1968 Tet Offensive, he learned how to play golf from a book that his Army buddy gave him, which was none other than The 5 Modern Fundamentals of Golf by Ben Hogan and Herbert Warren Wind. Nelson would go on to become a club pro when he came back from the war, eventually became a touring pro, and won 3 major championships, including the 1983 Open at Oakmont. In 1994, the U.S. Open came back to Oakmont, and it was won by a 24-year-old South African named Ernie Els, who would go on to be one of the biggest names in golf in the 1990s and into the 2000s. But that week is known for another reason, as it was Arnold Palmer's last U.S. Open. At that point, Arnold was in his 60s. He was well past his prime, and the USGA gave him special exemption to play in the Open that week. That way, he could say goodbye to the U.S. Open in his hometown at Oakmont. Palmer would miss the cut, but for those that were there, they said there was no bigger round of applause in any tournament at Oakmont than for Arnold's finishing final U.S. Open appearance. In 2007, the U.S. Open returned to Oakmont, and at this point, all the trees had been taken down from the golf course, and everybody expected Tiger Woods, who was the number 1 player in the world, to come through and conquer the beast, so to speak. And Tiger played incredibly well that week. He actually shot 5 over par or 6 over par for the week, which is really a rather high score for an Open. But he was bested by a 35-year-old Argentinian nicknamed El Pato, which means the duck, and that was Angel Cabrera. Cabrera won his first of 3 PGA Tour events at the 2007 U.S. Open at Oakmont, and the first of 2 majors. He'd go on to win the Masters in 2009. And then, of course, the final U.S. Open came just 4 years ago now at Oakmont in 2016, and that one was won by Dustin Johnson. Johnson is arguably one of the greatest players currently on the PGA Tour, and it was his first career major victory. He had several close calls in majors leading up to that, including the Open in 2015, but he finally broke through on Oakmont's links in 2016, and we look forward in just 5 short years to the U.S. Open returning to Western Pennsylvania, and it will be contested again at Oakmont Country Club. It is the 10th U.S. Open to ever be contested at the club, which is a record. The club has, I believe, 3 more, or will have 3 more U.S. Opens than the next closest host course in the United States. So I hope you learned a little something about the U.S. Opens here in Western Pennsylvania. You have the winners, Armour, Parks, Hogan, Nicklaus, Miller, Nelson, Els, Cabrera, and Dustin Johnson. And who knows who will be crowned U.S. Open champion when the Open returns in 2025. I hope you all enjoyed this week's video, this week's Fireside Chats. We will return next week with part 3 of the history of golf in Western Pennsylvania, where I'm going to talk about women's golf in our region, particularly the U.S. Women's Open, and arguably one of the greatest amateur golfers in golf history, Pittsburgh native Carol Semple Thompson. So I hope you'll come back next week and learn about women's golf in our area and learn a little bit about Carol, who is just an absolutely fascinating player in person. And I hope everybody's staying safe. I hope everybody's staying well. We can't wait to get back to the center and host full programs in the boycott room for you all to attend. And we can't wait for you guys to see what we're working on at the center with different exhibits and different things like that. So everybody stay safe, wash your hands, practice social distancing, and hopefully we'll be seeing everybody real soon at the center. And we'll see you all next week for our third chapter of the history of golf in Western Pennsylvania with Fireside Chats with Dave. Thanks. Have a good night, guys.